So our next speaker in the local government track is Ryan O'Neill from Penn State University, and he'll be talking with us about foreclosures, race, and income in Connecticut.
Hi, I'm Ryan. I'm a master's student in GIS at Penn State University. I'm taking the classes online, and I'm a lifelong Connecticut resident, which is why Connecticut. I'll be talking about spatial analysis of foreclosure sales in Connecticut from 2005 to 2017. So a quick overview of the presentation. I'll talk about why examining foreclosures is important, give some background and previous research and what data I used, the methodology, I'll talk about the analysis that I did, I'll have thoughts on the outcomes, and hopefully I'll have time for questions. So why examine foreclosures? It's important to remember that each foreclosure is someone losing their home. It's a basic idea, but it's important to keep in mind. It can have a lasting impact on a person and a family, emotional and financial. There are government impacts. It affects the social service safety net. The property tax base is affected. There's a decline in services that are provided to the locality. And then there are societal impacts, including an increase in crime where foreclosure rates have gone up. So just a quick thumbnail sketch about the subprime mortgage crisis. There was an increased investment in mortgage-backed securities where investors bought up mortgages, packaged them into bonds and other investment products, and then sold them. And those products were really popular because the return on investments was high. That led to more and more mortgages being sold and more and more mortgages being sold, given to people with less and less good credit. Housing prices dropped. The terms on adjustable rate mortgages, like the two-year period where it was okay, ended for a lot of adjustable rate mortgages, and then the interest rates went up. That led to people defaulting on their mortgages, led to a rise in foreclosures and foreclosure rates, and then we got the Great Recession and the end of Western civilization. So foreclosures, income, population demographics in Connecticut is what I'm looking at. Are foreclosures related to income? Are they related to race? As a whole, Connecticut racial disparity looks like this. The white population is 77%. 11% of the population is Black or African American. Here's an unfun fact. Connecticut's Gini index is the 48th worst. What that means is that the income inequality in the state has the most income inequality for a state, only behind New York and Louisiana. So related previous research, Colby and Lee, and then Lee separately, looked at the impact that foreclosures have on neighboring properties and how they're contagious, because as a property forecloses, the property values around the foreclosing area drop. Hall compared foreclosures to population per capita, and then Lichtenstein and Weber, this is a bit of a spoiler alert, but the foreclosures were concentrated in older African American neighbors when they looked at Tuscaloosa County, Alabama. So the foreclosure data comes from this great data source that Connecticut has. They have the Open Data Initiative, which is a repository for lots of data in the state. The database covers real estate sales from October 2001 through 2017. And it includes all types of real estate transactions, residential, commercial, all of that. And it has more than 850,000 records. So the records look like this. They have the listing year, the date of the transaction, the sales price, everything you could think of, including a note on whether or not it was a foreclosure sale. So this is foreclosure sales by month from 2005 to 2017. You can see at the far end, the early period, foreclosures are about 50 per month before the subprime crisis hits and it escalates over 200 per month. Then it drops back down. There's this dip in September 2011 where there's just 4 foreclosure sales. I don't know what that's about. But then things take off again, and to where it's almost twice as bad as it was during the subprime crisis. There's this gap here, which the database manager is aware of. There's no notation for whether or not what type of sale it was, so I couldn't determine what was a foreclosure sale and what wasn't. So I just have this gap here, which I just have to live with. So here are all those foreclosures mapped in Connecticut at once. And if you're familiar with Connecticut geography, you can pick out some of the urban areas. Here's Bridgeport and New Haven, the Hartford area, Torrington, Waterbury, Norwich, New London. It's not a surprise that those are where foreclosures are because those are where people are, but we'll get into that. So the parameters I set for myself for the project, I was going to look at demographics, median per capita income, the percentage of whites and African Americans in geographic units. I picked 4 years, 2005, 9, 13, and 17, because that's before, during, after the mortgage crisis, and then 2017 was the most recent available data. And then I picked 4 geographic units: towns, census tracts, census block groups, and sub-regional drainage basins. I'll touch on that in a minute. Much thanks to the Census Bureau. All of the demographic information comes from the Census Bureau because where else are you going to get it? They also have, and this is important, the number of single unit detached homes. That provided a basis of comparison for foreclosure sales, so I could determine the number of single unit detached homes in each geographic area, and that was how I compared things. So the geographic units, I wanted to avoid the modifiable area unit problem, the idea that your findings are affected by the geographic unit that you select. So I started with towns. There's 169 towns in Connecticut, and that's the basic local unit of government in Connecticut. There are only 8 counties in Connecticut. They don't have any meaning, so I totally ignored them. I went with census tracts and census block groups, and then I picked out sub-regional drainage basins. It's a non-population-based aerial unit, as the name would suggest, that it's the boundaries for sub-regional drainage basins. That's just what they are. And here is what each of those units looks like in the greater New Haven area. You can see that towns look like towns, tracts are slightly smaller, block groups are even smaller, and the sub-regional drainage basins are, in comparison, totally irregular. Some are long and thin, some are, not. And it just provides a different way of aggregating the data. So there are limitations to the analysis. The data doesn't capture all the foreclosures. In Connecticut, you can have foreclosures proceed by something other than the sale. There's a 2014-15 error in the data set. I used the 2000 census instead of the 2005 data because I wasn't able to find data for census tracts and block groups for 2005, and I wanted the data to be consistent across all the geographic units. So for the 2005 analysis, I used 2000's data. And then while doing the best I could to deal with the modifiable area unit problem, it still is a limit on the analysis. As is the time period I selected. I looked at years, and I could have looked at months, or I could have bonded multiple years together. So geocoding. I had 27,000 addresses to geocode, and so I looked at options that were free. There were 3 options that I found: Texas A&M's GeoServices, the Census Bureau, and Google Maps, and each operate about the same way. You take the addresses, you put them into a CSV file, you upload them, you wait, and then you download the file with the lat long. In reality, each of them is wonderful because that's just an amazing thing to be able to do. But I did want to use what I found to be the most accurate. I took 50 addresses across 3 towns. I hand-coded the lat long according to town GIS sites, and I submitted that set of 50 addresses to each of the 3 services, and I found that Texas A&M, was the most accurate. Texas A&M was the most accurate. The other good thing about Texas A&M was that you were able to do batches of 2,500 at a time. So it really cut down on the number of times they had to keep going back to a site and uploading batches of addresses. Back to the sub-regional drainage basins, I had to get the data into the sub-regional drainage basin layer. The census doesn't collect data on that basis, because why would they? So I started with the census tract layer because it was the layer that was closest in size. I made a raster layer for all the variables. I used QGIS's zonal statistics to convert the raster layers into the boundary layer. I used QGIS's count points and polygons for moving the foreclosure points into the layer. And then I used the good old field calculator to do all of the calculations. I used a few different statistical methods for the analysis. Global Moran's I, which is a measure of spatial autocorrelation. I used the local indicators of spatial association, or LISA. That's really good for revealing, as the slide says, revealing the existence and location of spatial groupings. Shows where on the map units with a high value or a low value are associated with other units with a high or low value. And then the one I was most excited about was nearest neighbor hierarchical clustering. It shows which units are grouped together because of similar values in all four variables. So you can see, well, I'll show you in a moment what that means. So just to get a little bit of the lay of the land of Connecticut, these are Core Plus of 2005 for each of the four variables at the town level. The red is low and the blue is high, because I wanted it that way. And so you can see how the land lays out in, like, for example, here's Fairfield County, high income. Here are Coroplus across the 4 years at the town level for the foreclosure rate. The most striking thing I thought about these four maps was the low foreclosure rate in most of the state here as compared to here, where the foreclosure rate is low in just a few towns and is really mixed throughout the state as a whole. I found that surprising and sad. I graphed the Moran's I scatter plots. You can see that on the top two, the census tracts and the census block groups both have a high spatial association, meaning that there's a strong relationship for the percentage of African Americans and the percentage of white people. Whereas the two units that are bigger and have more people in them, they have a weaker association. The association is pretty strong when it comes to income, and then for foreclosures, it's kind of a mixed bag. Towns, the association is basically non-existent, and well, we'll get to that point, because what's the deal there? Yeah, what is the deal with this one point in the sub-regional drainage basins? Well, this one unit right here is a single sub-regional drainage basin. You can see all these red dots. It touches Torrington and Waterbury. That had a huge effect on the outcome, that relationship. You can see in the LISA map that this long area is, it affected all the areas around it. And then in 2013, you can see that it goes back to about normal, where it was previously, where it was in 2017. There are very few foreclosures in that area, and then the effect is not there, which is an example of the modifiable aerial unit problem that I wanted to deal with. So the analysis, these are the LISA maps for 2009 at the block group level. I thought that these maps showed really well some spatial associations. The one in the left and this one here on the right show the association between units with high or low percentage of whites and percentage of African Americans. And the maps are basically an inverse of one another. You can see in this map that there's selected areas, which I know are urban areas, where there are a high association of, where there's a strong association between units that have a high percentage of African Americans. You can see that down here there's a strong association with units with a high median income. And then this one has kind of, in here it has spots where there's associations with foreclosure rate. The cluster maps, these are, I was excited about these. So these are from the census tract level from 2005 and 2009. I get to the next 2 years on the next slide. So the red areas, they can be hard to see. There's here and here and here and here, which Hartford, Waterbury, Meriden, New Haven, Bridgeport, which are all cities. They have the red areas which show it's lower income, lower than average income, lower than average percentage of white people, higher than average percentage of African Americans, and very much above average rate of foreclosure. So all of those areas share that in common. Likewise, in 2009, you get the same areas. And then in 2013, that association that includes African Americans goes away as more foreclosures, as more areas experience foreclosures. And then fewer, in here, I am not sure, but there are fewer, those areas disappear again. And the association with African Americans still isn't there for areas with a really high rate of foreclosure. Now, this slide and the next slide are cluster maps from 2017 at each of the geographic units. You can see the block groups, you can't really see, I did the best I could, but the block groups are really small and they're in about where you would expect them to be based on the previous maps. Below average income, below average white people, above average African Americans, and really, really high rate of foreclosure. Again, the association between lower income and increased rate of foreclosure exists, but the association with African Americans does go away at the census tract level. And then at the town level, it's again spread out below, but the relationship between income and foreclosures is still there. And this I found really interesting. Again, if you're familiar with Connecticut geography, you can pick out river basins. This is the Thames, this is the Connecticut, this is the Quinnipiac, this is the Naugatuck, and then this is the Housatonic River. I was not expecting this result, but apparently river basins experience low income and high rates of foreclosure. I would not have found that without using subregional drainage basins. So, conclusions. Relationships exist between lower income homeowners and increased rates of foreclosure. Areas with higher percentage of African American homeowners and increased foreclosure, although not as strongly. High income homeowners and fewer foreclosures. I didn't highlight that, but it's a very strong association. At no point did higher income homeowners experience increased rates of foreclosure. The relationships are consistent across the geographic units, but they're stronger as the units decrease in size and population. The subprime crisis had an impact on the frequency of foreclosures and is casting a long shadow, and I'm not sure why. But according to recent newspaper reports, only 10 of 169 towns in Connecticut have experienced home values return to the level that they were before the subprime crisis, which, again, I'm not sure why. I'm just producing the data. So what does it mean? In Connecticut, policymakers and nonprofits have to be aware that foreclosures are still a problem. We're 10 years on from the subprime crisis. It's easy to think that it's just a memory, but foreclosures are still a problem, and you still have to be aware. So stricter regulations on mortgages and more mortgage qualifications, providing financial education and counseling to affected areas, and increasing affordable housing options. So thank you for listening. Time for questions. Yes.
What's the logical relationship between catch basins and the analysis you're trying to do?
I'm sorry, what?
The catch basins layer that you use?
Yep.
What's the logical?
I needed, I picked it at random, essentially. I needed a unit that, with boundaries that, where a boundary shapefile existed, that the boundaries weren't drawn on the basis of population. And then I used that not as a control, but as something separate from the other three units where all the boundaries were drawn based on where people lived. And this was just based on geographical features.
So did you discover anything by using it other than finding, you know, the parameters you're looking for?
Well, if I didn't use it, I wouldn't have found that the river basin, like along the major rivers in Connecticut, that there were higher foreclosure rates all along each of the major rivers.
That was the discovery.
Yeah, that wouldn't have come out at all. Yeah.
Good job.
Thanks.
We have time for more questions.
I just had, since you're from Connecticut, I was just wondering if you know of any kind of historical reasons you would see that demographics along the river basins. Because I love the idea of using those,
Yeah.
but there are obviously historical reasons people lived on rivers versus in other areas. So I don't know if you happen to have a hypothesis.
I know that in eastern Connecticut, there's a history of manufacturing, especially along rivers because it was a power source. And once that went away, as the economy changed, the average income declined. But I was really surprised that it was really specific along that river, because it happens there was manufacturing along a lot of other minor rivers too, not just major rivers. So I was surprised. And I'm still not entirely sure.
No, it's interesting. I like it a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I've always been under the impression that mortgages or the foreclosures have gone down since 2008, but they look like they've gotten worse and worse.
Nationally, foreclosures have gone down.
Okay.
Connecticut's foreclosure rate, this is a really good question because I meant to include it.
Okay.
But Connecticut's foreclosure rate is about 30% higher than the national rate. I looked for
Wow.
a month-by-month thing from 2005 onward, and I couldn't really find it, so I did skip it. But you make a good point. It is a problem specifically in Connecticut at this point.
So Maine is a place that has really major differences geographically in areas where the economic recovery has really penetrated, like southern Maine, Portland area, and places where it really hasn't or is only just now getting started, eastern and northern Maine. And so I wonder if Connecticut obviously is a tiny, in fact, the county where I work is about the size of Connecticut. So I know that geographically it's very small, but it seemed like the foreclosure problems were centered on those urban and those older urban areas. Is there a larger context that the economic recovery hasn't really reached those areas as effectively as it has others, or?
I know that the unemployment rate in those areas is also lower. I'm not sure about other factors. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much.
Do we,
Oh,
one
I'm
more?
sorry, I didn't see it.
When you were trying to divide up your demographic data by drainage basins,
Mm-hmm.
how comfortable were you with how the existing units fit into those? Did you have cases where you made a choice to slice them in half or anything like that?
The way the method that I used for putting the tracks onto that boundary layer, I don't know how to explain this because I can't quite remember exactly how I did it. Yeah. You've stumped me.
Up the challenge.
Yeah, that's a thing that I should know because I did it. I'm sorry I can't give you a better answer than
You'll remember when you write your thesis.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
But did you use some kind of algorithm to split the districts and take a percentage and allocate?
I used QGIS to do it. Sorry to any Esri people, but it's free. And when I started the project, I didn't have an Esri license, and I just kept using what I was using. So it puts the boundary layer, the track layer on top of, and it does split, like, so if it crosses over, some gets allocated to one drainage basin and some gets allocated to another. Not necessarily in proportion with how much is over, but in proportion to how much is over. Like, so if 70% of a drainage basin comes from one area and 30% comes from a different tract, then that's the mix that will end up in that regional drainage, sub-regional drainage basin.
So you weren't looking at settlement patterns or anything like that?
No, I mean, because that was the point of not, like, I specifically didn't want to look at how things were settled and populated. Yeah. Thanks.
All right, we got a couple minutes to set up the next presentation. So our next speaker in the local government track is Ryan O'Neill from Penn State University, and he'll be talking with us about foreclosures, race, and income in Connecticut.
Hi, I'm Ryan. I'm a master's student in GIS at Penn State University. I'm taking the classes online, and